Im Osten setzt unsere Führung dem Massendruck der Sowjets.
At the height of World War II, with Hitler's armed forces extended through countries he'd already crushed, the Nazis recruited tens of thousands of Muslim soldiers. This dramatic departure from reliance on so-called Aryan German troops happened first on the Eastern Front against the Soviet Union.
During the summer of 1941, over 4 million Soviet soldiers were captured by the German armed forces. Many of those were Muslim, and many of those were given the opportunity after capture to join their captors, and many took it.
Hitler's claim that his conquering armies would be purely German was also turned on its head in Yugoslavia. In this riveting story, a rare eyewitness from inside the Waffen-SS recalls how this brutal, ultra-racist force not only recruited 40,000 Muslims, but then went out of its way to meet their spiritual and cultural needs.
Was die Freiheit der Ausüben der Religion.
Their freedom of religious practice as Muslims had already been established. The ban on eating pork, prayers at least so many times a day, funeral duties, and until the end, that was all held to. It was absolutely no problem.
Absolut kein Problem.
Although far more Muslims fought with the Allies than with Hitler, not least across the Middle East and North Africa, the creation of Hitler's Muslim legions is one of the more intriguing and remarkable stories of World War II. It all began in June 1941, when Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa against the Soviet Union. To that point, the greatest military invasion in history.
In 1941, when Hitler attacked Russia, the general expectation was that the place wouldn't last for more than about 6 weeks. And the famous phrase was, we'll kick the door in and the house will fall down.
But, says Professor Norman Stone, Hitler and his generals had made gigantic miscalculations, not least over the massive casualties they would suffer, and the need for reinforcements.
They didn't plan it in a strategic way because they thought they would win the war in the summer. And then once it drags on, they're forced into a position where they have to start recruiting to augment their own ranks, because they'd started off with an army which was really much too small for the job. And after all, they were having to keep troops in Greece, keep troops in France, troops in Norway, troops all over the place. They were desperately overstretched and they needed local help.
The German armed forces took millions of Soviet prisoners. Among them were many Muslims from the southern Soviet republics. But their conditions in captivity were appalling, and most faced a stark choice: a slow and dreadful death, or changing sides.
Hitler and Goering and company didn't really propose to waste food, as they called it, on Russian prisoners of war, so they were starving. And cases of cannibalism, 5-6 of them died in horrible circumstances. And if you're starving like that, and then somebody comes along and says, volunteer to, drive the donkeys for the German army in Krasnogorsk or some such place, you might well act in that way.
The new recruits were from places like Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan. It's estimated that 150,000 Muslim troops joined the Nazi ranks on the Eastern Front. They were known as willing helpers, and to start with, says Jonathan Trigg, author of A History of the Nazis' Islamic Forces, these Muslims did only auxiliary work.
Soviet soldiers who happened to be Muslim were captured, were kept in the front line by their German captors in order to carry rations, carry weapons, and then over time those individuals went from carrying rations to carrying guns.
To what extent was there an anti-Soviet motivation among the Muslim recruits from the southern republics?
That was a very strong motivation indeed. In the previous 20 years, the Soviet communist system had hugely oppressed their religion and the peoples themselves. So many saw, falsely of course, that Hitler and the German army were there to liberate them.
And as the German army began inducting thousands of these Muslims, commanders were ordered to honour the Islamic beliefs and culture of their new recruits.
They were allowed to practice their own religion, which was still anathema within the Soviet armed forces. So they had their own imams, they could pray as and when required under the laws of Islam, and of course they had special rations, so they weren't given alcohol or given pork.
As the Germans increasingly met fierce Soviet resistance, they lost from their own ranks 1 million fighting men, dead or injured. So the need to build new fighting units from their Muslim recruits was urgent.
The really prominent unit formed, first of all, was the Turkmen Division. And that, if you like, was an amalgamation of a whole series of battalions and regiments, eventually numbering over 20,000 men. The Turkmen Division was moderately successful. It wasn't equipped or trained to be an elite unit, but neither was it a disaster.
But at the heart of this recruitment of Muslims lay a massive contradiction. Hitler had earlier decreed that none but Germans should bear arms to enforce the world domination he dreamed of by the mythical Aryan race.
Hitler himself wasn't particularly keen on having anything other than blonde, blue-eyed Germans fighting for him, or at least people with a kind of Germanic background, like, say, the Dutch or the Belgian Flemish. But he was more or less forced into a position of having to accept that there were other people. And after all, he was in alliance with the Japanese, who were hardly Aryan.
And, at the outset at least, none in the Nazi armed forces were more pedantic on the issue of race than the special Nazi Party army, the Waffen-SS, and their ultimate supremo, Heinrich Himmler.
In the Waffen-SS, Himmler and his entourage would carry out a whole series of checks on individuals, both on their racial ancestry. So, for instance, officers would have to develop their family tree back to 1750 to ensure that there was no Jewish blood there. They would also have all of their photos viewed individually by Himmler to see, did they actually look Aryan enough?
But events and the need for military manpower soon dictated a loosening of these rigid criteria, and Himmler was forced to come to terms with recruiting Muslims who bore no resemblance to the Aryan stereotype.
In a racial context, the recruitment of significant Muslim units in the German armed forces is incredible, particularly with Himmler's views on race. The Waffen-SS itself was very much seen at its inauguration as being the racial pinnacle of the Aryan nation, if you like. Everyone was the super tall, blonde-haired, blue-eyed giant, very much the epitome of the master race. So therefore the recruitment of very large numbers of Muslims, particularly from the southern Soviet Union, Turkic peoples and so on, is very much the antithesis of that racial illusion.
But there turned out also to be a need to recruit other Muslims far away from the Eastern Front, in Yugoslavia. And to help them in that task, the Nazis could turn to an unlikely figure from the Middle East, who came to Germany in 1941. His name was Hajj Amin al-Husseini, but more crucial was his title, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. He was from a leading Palestinian family and had become an important political and religious player, says Dr. Taj Hargey of the Muslim Educational Centre in Oxford.
He quickly rose to be an influential figure in Mandate Palestine. In the interwar period, between 1920 to 1939, he is the leading Arab voice in Palestine, resisting what he considered Jewish illegal immigration to his homeland, and also fought against the establishment of a national Jewish homeland in Palestine.
The Mufti came to believe that the main obstacles facing the Arabs in Palestine were the Jews, the British and the Communists, a line-up of enemies coinciding very closely with Hitler's own hit list.
The Grand Mufti went to Berlin to gain material and moral support from the Nazis. He was exceptionally well treated. He was given his own accommodation, unlimited funds. He was allowed to meet with propagandists, both from the Nazi side as well as from the Arab side, to convince Muslims in Palestine and wider Arab world that Muslim solidarity was with the Nazis, with the Axis powers, rather than with the Allied powers.
And the Nazis soon saw just how useful the Mufti might be to them. There was one problem. To mix openly with an Arab was, from the racial standpoint, awkward for Hitler. However, the Mufti was not of typical Arab appearance, and this allowed the Führer to justify meeting him, says Professor Gilbert Ashkar of London University.
The very idea of meeting someone who belonged to an inferior race in Hitler's conception of things was a problem to him. With regard to the Mufti himself, they had to convince themselves that given his blue eyes and red hair, he had some non-Semite blood in his veins, so he was not fully Semitic.
So they kidded himself that he wasn't really an Arab?
In some sense, yes.
So the Arabs were well down the list of the Nazis' favoured races, were they?
Absolutely. Originally they were very much down the list. But they got promoted, if one could say, for very opportunistic reasons after Germany and Italy believed that they could try to bring Muslims to their side in their fight against the British and later the Americans.
At that time, the Allies were also in another kind of fight with Hitler, a propaganda battle of the airwaves, as reported by the BBC at the time.
Here is London, broadcasting in the Arabic language.
By means of propaganda, written and spoken, in the Arabic tongue, an intense effort was being made to poison the minds of these peoples against Britain. Incidentally, the declarations made by the leading Arab rulers in support of the Allied cause have recently shown how little success attended this effort.
But even as Britain tried to get the upper hand in this war of words, the Nazis had discovered a valuable asset in the shape of the Mufti. The Mufti shared with the Nazis a bitter hatred of the Jews, and he began to make a series of virulent propaganda broadcasts targeted against them from Radio Zesen in Berlin, says German writer Matthias Kinzel.
This idea was brought up already in the year 1937 by a friend of the Mufti in Berlin. And so when the Mufti arrived in Berlin, he was prepared to take the lead of the anti-Semitic programs of Radio Zesen, and he very often did the broadcasting by himself. And so his person became so much known throughout the Islamic world because he was one of the main speakers of Radio Zesen during those years.
The Nazis had another use for the Mufti, much closer to home than the Arab world. They wanted his help in Yugoslavia. There, while a conflict of extreme savagery was in progress, Hitler didn't want to commit his best troops, says historian Marco Attila-Hor.
The Germans weren't particularly interested in this region. It was really like a buffer zone between Germany and Italy. So the Germans didn't really contribute or commit large quantities of quality troops to this region, so that their hope was that you could garrison Yugoslavia with a small number of low-quality troops, with Quisling forces, and commit your main forces where they were needed, against the Soviets on the Eastern Front.
So the Germans decided to recruit Muslims from Bosnia to help wage the struggle for Yugoslavia on their behalf. At that time, Bosnia was ruled by a puppet Croatian fascist regime, which was in turn under attack from Tito and the partisans, who were backed by Britain. So, in early 1943, the Mufti travelled to Bosnia to help raise the manpower for a new Nazi fighting unit, says Dr. Taj Harge.
The Mufti met personally with all the regiment leaders, the commanders of the various units of the SS, both German and Muslim, and he was seen to be photographed with them. These photographs were sent out as media press releases, not only to the troops, but also to the various populations in Bosnia and elsewhere. When the Mufti comes in as a leading figure in the recruitment drive, this then gives religious substance to a patriotic yearning for national independence and self-determination.
But it's a yearning for national independence, not a lot of Muslims who are intent on waging a holy war in Europe.
No, clearly not. It had nothing or very little to do with Nazi atrocities, with Nazi objectives, with Nazi aspirations. What the Bosnian Muslims were doing was to try to secure their place in the sun, in the Balkan Peninsula.
The men recruited by the Nazis in Bosnia were built into a Waffen-SS division called the Handjar, from a Turkish word meaning scimitar, says Jonathan Trigg. And the great majority of these troops were Muslims.
The scimitar division was very large. It was some 20,000 men strong, and it was formed from the villages and towns that we all know, Tuzla, Gorazde, Sarajevo, and so on. Local men volunteered, were recruited and armed and trained. They were under attack from all sides at the time, and they felt the best way to safeguard themselves and their families was to arm and equip themselves under German auspices.
The Scimitar Division had its own magazine, and working on it was a keen 19-year-old ethnic German, Zvonimir Bernwald, now in his 80s. One of a handful of survivors, he lives today in a small town in southern Germany. with a collection of cuttings, documents and snapshots relating to that strange military formation.
Zweites Foto.
This is a picture from the Imam's training course in Babelsberg. The Grand Mufti visited us there. Here he is being welcomed. I'm the last here at the back, and here I am there.
Hier bin ich da.
Zvonimir Bernward says the Mufti of Jerusalem, despite his role in military recruitment, came across mainly as an intellectual.
Großmufti war.
The Grand Mufti was short and looked much more like a university professor or an academic or a religious teacher than in any way like a fighter. When he spoke calmly in Arabic. I didn't understand a word except through the translation. He gave the impression of a committed teacher of religion.
Religionslehrers auf mich. In Sarajevo
In Sarajevo, he had 16 imams, some of them young, who had volunteered for the Scimitar Division. And our job was to teach these young Bosnians, who probably knew nothing about National Socialism and the ideas of the Waffen-SS, as much as possible about National Socialist ideology in 3 weeks. We had to write down all the things we wanted to tell these people. What were the points of contact between National Socialism and Islam?
Nationalsozialismus und Islam.
As for the Bosnian Muslim soldiers forming the new Waffen-SS Scimitar Division, they were often working alongside German soldiers, and some of the Germans found it hard to suppress the racism so deeply instilled in them under the Third Reich.
Yes, there was some name-calling, but that was strictly forbidden. There was a command from Himmler himself. You would suffer the strictest punishment if you called them mujos in public. You weren't allowed to do that. Mujos is a derogatory term for Bosnians. Bosniak can be a bit dismissive, mujos much more. A bit like Ivan for the Russians, but a bit worse.
Ivan, ein bisschen mehr für die Russen. Sie dürfen nicht vergessen, die Bosniaken.
You mustn't forget that the Bosnians were really simple farmers' sons. From the beginning we had to practically teach some of them their ABC. So we had a magazine that didn't try to do anything too complicated. It had many pictures, simple sentences. That was while the training was going on in France. And then we went back to Germany. We only came back to Bosnia in February 1944. During that time, they had very little contact with their homeland, except for this Scimitar magazine of ours.
Bis auf diese Handjar-Zeitschrift.
But how much did Nazism and the Mufti's brand of Islam really have in common? At that time, while their long-term goals diverged, there were shared interests.
Die Ziele war zuerst mal den Imamen.
The first, most important thing wasn't to find a synthesis between Islam and National Socialism, but that both views of the world wanted to achieve the same thing. Their common enemies were, of course, Jews, Anglo-Americans, Communists and Freemasons.
Kommunisten, Freimaurer.
In the new SS division, the Bosnian soldiers wore the fez, just as they had done in much earlier Bosnian regiments under the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And a German newsreel in World War II showed the new division being reviewed by none other than the SS chief himself, Heinrich Himmler.
Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler besichtigt eine neu aufgestellte Freiwilligendivision.
Bei den Muslimen waren die Handjar-Division immer beliebt.
The Muslims always loved the Scimitar Division. It was their people, who they had a close connection to. The fez was better than the Red Star of the partisans. That's clear.
Bei den Partisanen. Das ist ganz klar.
The Scimitar Division was removed from the chaos of Yugoslavia to be trained in France, but being sent so far from their homeland sapped the morale of the Muslim troops, especially when they began to hear of atrocities against their people back in Bosnia. So, one summer night, a group of them staged an armed revolt against their officers. This action, although short-lived, was the only mutiny ever recorded in the Waffen-SS, says Jonathan Trigg.
The mutiny was started by 4 individuals who were, without doubt, agents provocateurs from Tito's partisans, there to stir up trouble. They managed to get a larger number of their own troops, several hundred men, to fight alongside them. They murdered their German officers, and their idea was that they were then going to march to the sea.
What happened in the end, though?
Literally, the mutiny only lasted one night, whereupon some of their own religious leaders, some of their imams, spoke to the mutineers, managed to convince them that this was folly. They then turned on their own ringleaders, who were either killed, captured or dispersed.
So what military role did the Bosnian Muslim soldiers play? The Scimitar Division finally came up against Tito's partisans in the spring of 1944.
The Scimitar Division became very much involved in what was guerrilla and counter-guerrilla operations back in Bosnia. This was dirty local fighting in the hills and mountains of Yugoslavia against their fellow Yugoslavs, the partisans. The Scimitar Division were very successful, particularly in the opening weeks and months of their campaign. They were extremely pleased to be back on home turf and looking after their villages and communities.
When was all that going on, and how did things begin to change?
That was towards the end of 1943 and the beginning of 1944. However, by that time, particularly as spring 1944 went on, it was absolutely clear to most of the Bosnian Muslims involved that the Germans were going to lose the war, and they were going to be on the receiving end of a vengeful Tito and his partisans.
The conflict in Yugoslavia was often barbaric, and there is still debate among historians over how the Muslim troops behaved in relation to others. The consensus seems to be that the Scimitar Division did commit atrocities, but no more so than other units in that conflict, a view accepted by Islamic cleric Dr. Taj Halge.
Some of the crimes were perpetrated by the Scimitar Division of the SS, because I think we have a combination of factors here. You have the SS ruthlessness combined with Muslim fervour to attain freedom. And to them, the idea of freedom is to have a scorched earth policy, because their opponents, the Croats, the Serbs, and the partisans, were their enemies for so many generations.
And what about war crimes in the East? When the Polish Home Army staged an uprising in Warsaw against the Nazis late in the war, German forces hit back with severe repression against fighters, civilians, women and children alike. Jonathan Trigg says both regular army and Waffen-SS soldiers took part, including Muslim units.
The suppression of the Warsaw Uprising was particularly bloody. The evidence of atrocities is well documented and is horrendous. Several Muslim units, along with non-Muslim units, very much ran amok. It is a truly horrific story. The Muslims were not the major instigators of massacres in the uprising. However, they were there, and they were without doubt involved in atrocities against the local civilian population.
By late 1944 and early 45, Nazi forces in the East were retreating from a Russian military onslaught. And the Soviet Muslims who'd defected to the Nazi side years earlier faced being dealt with as traitors if and when they fell into Soviet hands, says Norman Stone.
Well, the people who'd been captured in German uniform or working for the Germans simply wouldn't have survived. If they survived, it would have been by a fluke. I think they were served long, long years in camps at the absolute best.
And at the worst?
Oh, they'd just have been killed.
Shot on the spot?
Yes, more or less on the spot.
Back in Yugoslavia, Tito's communist partisans, getting air supplies from the Allies, were also now reversing the Nazi tide. And the Muslims of the Waffen-SS Scimitar Division were on the back foot. However, when their commanders ordered a retreat and tried to march them north towards Germany, says Marco Attila-Hor, Muslim soldiers once again defied orders and began to desert.
The desertions from the Bosnian SS division begin as a trickle during 1944, and as the year comes to a close and as 1945 begins, it becomes like a flood, should we say. We're talking in the hundreds and then the thousands. Bosnian SS troops deserting and joining the partisans, and then becoming incorporated into partisan units and proving actually very effective fighters for the partisans against the Germans, turning the Germans' own training against them.
So they're changing to the Allied side of the war, basically, a lot of them.
That's right, yes. A couple of thousand of them, at least, become highly effective partisan soldiers against the Germans.
Oh, what about the other 18,000?
It's a variety of different fates. Some of them are then disarmed by the British and handed back to the partisans and are massacred. I mean, the partisans carry out serious war crimes against these defeated prisoners and prisoners of war. I mean, a lot of them simply deserted. I mean, the division collapsed, essentially. It crumbled, so thousands of them then simply went home.
While many Muslim soldiers paid with their lives for joining the Nazi cause, the man who urged them on with his propaganda broadcasts, the Mufti of Jerusalem, was able to slip away from the devastation. He went first to France and later the Middle East. He died in 1974. German writer Matthias Künzel fears that in recent years the Mufti may have become an inspiration to Islamic terrorists.
People only know about the war years of the Mufti, and this is not the main story to tell of him, because his real meaning comes when you see at the Islamic anti-Semitism case, because he was the very first one to translate Christian anti-Semitism into an Islamic language. This was something very new during those years, and in this way he stamped his mark on the Middle East conflict that are still with us today, I think.
But any suggestion that the Mufti is venerated among Islamic militants or the groups backing Palestinian independence like the PLO or Hamas is firmly rejected by Professor Gilbert Achcar.
Well, he's a completely discredited historical figure. He was discredited because his legacy has been one of defeat, and therefore when the PLO was created in 1964, he was not involved. He was marginalized, and there is no celebration of the Mufti anywhere in the Arab world. There is no street named, even in Palestinian camps, after him.
The PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, you're saying they didn't make him into a hero in any way?
Of course not. All statements by leaders of the Palestine Liberation Organization about the Mufti were actually distancing themselves from him and considering that his collaboration with the Nazis was a major mistake.
As for the tens of thousands of Muslim troops who joined the German army and the Waffen-SS, how should they be judged? According to Dr. Taj Hage, they were struggling for their own survival, and their actions should be seen in that light.
The Muslims who fought for the Nazis, whether in the Balkans or in Central Asia or in the Caucasus, sadly are now a historical relic. Most of them are forgotten. What should be remembered that they, rightly or wrongly, engaged in a catastrophic miscalculation, but for laudable reasons of securing independence and freedom.
It was largely circumstances rather than ideology which brought Muslims and Nazis together. What the story of that short-lived episode in World War II casts most light upon is the extent of the contradictions and absurdities with which Nazism was riddled.